Imagine an infinitely flat plane, existing only in two dimensions, the x and y axes. Now imagine a sentient square living on that flat plane, moving around freely, but only in those two dimensions. Now imagine that a cube appears, bisecting the flat plane. To the square, the cube would look just like itself, a square, even if it moved up and down on the z-axis. But if the cube moves so far on the z-axis that it popped out of the xy plane, the square would think it just disappeared into nothingness. Now replace the cube with the sphere. The square sees the sphere as a simple two-dimensional circle, but when the sphere moves up and down on the z-axis, it seems to change size. The square sees the sphere moving as a circle getting bigger and bigger, and then reversing course and getting smaller and smaller until it disappears entirely. The square can't comprehend the circle being all of those sizes at the same time, the same way that to us, a four-dimensional square would just look like a three-dimensional cube. Now imagine there's another infinitely flat plane above the other one. Our square would never be able to move from one plane to the other, since that would require traveling in the third dimension, but if he somehow warped to the second plane, he would feel right at home, because the second plane has the same number of dimensions as his home reality. Just two. This is the plot of the 1884 geometry-based satirical novella Flatland. It is also the plot of The Ring. Yes, I mean that B-tier horror movie franchise about the creepy girl with the ratty hair who crawls out of the TV. Let me explain. First, let's talk about everyone's least favorite trope. It was a dream all along. Or they were in purgatory all along. Or the story was fiction within fiction. This is separate from the last chance of the psyche trope, which I made a video about and you should definitely go watch it. The most famous example of this trope, The Wizard of Oz, usually gets a pass from the haters because it is a classic, but also because the reality of Dorothy's world is so much less interesting than Oz and only takes up a fraction of the screen time. The story is about Dorothy and Oz, and it shouldn't really matter to the viewer whether or not Oz exists in Dorothy's home reality, because all fiction comes with a built-in agreement. The viewer or the listener will suspend their knowledge that none of this actually happened, which will allow them to live vicariously through characters they know never actually existed. This is an unspoken truth of all fiction ever, and everyone follows this rule, unless you're like the ultimate killjoy, but even though everyone follows this unspoken agreement, you can kinda get lost in the sauce when it involves fiction within fiction. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, another kids' classic, focuses on a story told by one of the characters, so functionally the same level of reality as Oz is to Dorothy, but this movie spends a lot more time in the outer world than The Wizard of Oz. If you happen to be someone who likes to pick apart the logic of 60-year-old kids' movies, the ultimate killjoy, you might watch Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and wonder if you should really care about the characters in the story as much as you care about Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. I mean, it's just a story being told by the dad to his kids in a pretty normal world. He could end the story at any second, and the movie could switch back to the outer reality, or he could remember he has somewhere to be and slap a really unsatisfying ending on there. But the dad in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang isn't just the narrator, he's also the lead character in the story within the story. That's opposed to someone like Grandpa Columbo from The Princess Bride, who narrates the fictional story of Wesley and Buttercup to his grandson and presents it to the viewer. But he doesn't change anything in the story, which allows the story of Wesley and Buttercup to have an internal consistency. which you would expect from any fiction. But what about when "it was all a dream" is supposed to be a twist and not just a framing device? One of the most notable examples is St. Elsewhere, whose surprise ending is probably better known by now than the show itself. After 6 seasons of medical dark comedy drama, the writers decided to reveal to the audience that one of the characters, an autistic teenager, had actually been imagining the entire show. This ending was controversial when it came out, and I can definitely understand that, but my question is, what does it actually change about the show itself? This outer layer of reality is only ever seen in the very last scene of the show, and it's not like the kid with the snow globe could have stepped in any previous episode and changed things up. The ending revelation of Lost, I think, actually has a much bigger effect retroactively on the show, because we find out that the characters have been living most of the last season in a purgatory-like world. But unlike St. Elsewhere, the viewer is actually very familiar with the real world outside the purgatory world, because it's where most of the show has taken place. In her dissertation, Dancing Dwarves and Talking Fish, The Narrative Functions of Television Dreams, Cynthia Burkhead, PhD, writes that the snow globe scene, quote, reminds viewers that the fiction they have watched for 6 years is actually fiction within a fiction, occupying a second level of unreality, one level beyond the space of illusion filled by all narrative television. The St. Elsewhere finale currently sits as number 1 on IMDb's list of the worst TV finales of all time, and I found a BuzzFeed listicle version, because apparently BuzzFeed still exists in the year of our Lord 2026, where readers were asked to name the worst finale of all time, and one guy just wrote, St. Elsewhere. Imagine watching 6 seasons of a TV show and finding out it wasn't even real. Now, don't get me wrong, I know it must have been a gut punch to watch that last scene when it first came out in 1988. I'm not saying anyone's wrong for being disappointed or for feeling like NBC just had a massive and intentional bowel movement all over their 6 years of good memories. I'm just saying there might be another way of looking at it.
It was an imaginary story dreamt by Jimmy Olsen after he was kicked in the head by Supergirl's horse Comet. It never really happened.
None of these things ever really happened.
Get out of my store.
The world of St. Elsewhere is just as real as any other fiction, which is to say not real at all, and the same goes for the final scene. It's extraneous to the show you've been watching for 6 years. The Garfield fans among you will know what I mean when I say it's similar to the events of October 1989. Actually, who's to say that the last scene of St. Elsewhere isn't the dream? The scene before it showed the kid standing in the hospital and watching the snow outside, so what if he just took a nap and dreamed he was an extra-dimensional deity staring into the snow globe of reality below him? That symbolism will come back later, I promise. Thinking about this type of ending brought me back to a few months ago when people online were spreading around this inane fan theory that Stranger Things was going to end with the revelation that the whole show was just a game of Dungeons and Dragons being played by the Core 4 in a non-supernatural world. That in turn reminded me of this meme I've been seeing for at least a decade now. How screwed up would it be if the last sentence of the last Harry Potter book was, "and then Harry woke up back in his bed under the staircase"? My answer to that question is, yeah, it would be screwed up from a grammatical standpoint, but what would it actually change about the rest of the Harry Potter books? If Stranger Things cut away from the nonsensical fustercluck they called a finale and revealed a digitally de-aged version of the Core 4, that wouldn't be a bad ending to the show. It would just not be an ending. If Mike and Co. live in a Hawkins without Vecna, and Harry Potter lives in a Privet Drive without magic, then these would essentially be brand new characters we've never seen before and have no attachment to. The same goes for the Snow Globe kid, since his dad is now a construction worker and one of the other doctors from the show is now his grandfather. This is actually the plot of Fionna and Cake, where we meet a blasé millennial version of Fiona the human living in a semi-realistic modern world. Even without all the multiverse lore, this version of Fiona existing doesn't take away from the good times we had with the original in Adventure Time. If anything, it was disappointing in Fiona's first appearance to find out that her world wasn't real in the main world of Adventure Time, except that it's a kid show, so you can still sit back and relax and have some fun. And unlike Pope Francis, Fiona did eventually get canonized. Just a little Catholic humor for you. That'll come back later too. The St. Elsewhere snow globe may have been a reference to Citizen Kane, which I also have a video on, you should go watch it, but it provides us with a neat visual for a Russian doll style nesting universe of fiction. That's Russian Doll, the actual toy, not the show starring Natasha Lyonne, which I just realized I've never actually mentioned on this channel, which seems crazy. Someday. But of course, aside from one particularly dread-inducing episode of Black Mirror, snow globes only have one interior scene. For the purpose of symbolizing stacking realities, I prefer a more layer-centric analogy, like an onion. Specifically, a glass onion. Because you can see into the layer below you, but not the one below that, and the people below you can't see you, and you can't see the layer above you, because it's frosted glass, or it's a two-way mirror. I don't know, just pretend that a glass onion is something that exists and that people have in their house, and only being able to see one way is like an inherent part of it. It's just a fun visual metaphor that the Beatles and Netflix can't technically trademark. A perfect example of a glass onion story is Mark Z. Danielewski's House of Leaves. Even apart from all of its ergotic. Aside from all its ergodic formatting, House of Leaves is overseen by a fictional, unnamed editor, who is editing the musings of a fictional guy named Johnny Truant, who is editing a book written by a guy named Zampano about the fictional found footage movie shot by a guy named Will Davidson, who is reading a book called House of Leaves. The real-life reader is never really given a hint as to what's real in the book, or which layer of the glass onion they should suspend the most belief for. It's definitely possible that the editor and Johnny Truant and Zampano and Will Davidson all exist on the same level of reality, but it's equally possible that the editor is real and he's editing a fiction novel written by a guy using the pen name Johnny Truant, which is a fictional editing of a novel by a fictional guy named Zampano, which is an analysis of the equally fictional Davidson record by the fictional Will Davidson. It's stated all throughout the book that Johnny Truant can't find any evidence of the Davidson record actually existing, least of all the quotes from famous authors like Donna Tartt and Stephen King, which Zampano references throughout the book. But Will Davidson is the most commonly seen character in the book. By the logic that most of St. Elsewhere wasn't real, the reader of House of Leaves should really only care what the unnamed editor has to say, even though his contributions are only like 2 pages total. The most obvious answer is that Zampano is a real guy in Johnny Truant's world, but that he was writing a novel under the guise of an analysis, kind of like Danielewski did in real life. But if you only read the parts of the book that don't explicitly exist in a reality below Johnny's, that's like most of the book. That's like all the parts that aren't just about a guy getting laid and starving to death. House of Leaves crushes the glass onion to pieces, or at least polishes up all the layers so you can see everything at once, and by doing this, Danielewski made it impossible for the reader to write off any layer of his fiction as not real. So we've been talking about double fiction, but fiction about simulated realities is a whole different percolator of fish. Obviously, we know from early on in The Matrix that Neo's world is actually a computer simulation, collectively projected into the minds of dormant humans. So we don't really have to wonder which layer of reality we should take more seriously, or which one matters more. Obviously, the answer is neither. They coexist in the story, and they're equally as important to the plot. And The Matrix isn't exactly fiction within fiction, it's more just a lower level of reality than Zion. Same goes for Ready Player One and Free Guy and other simulation fiction, some of which has gotta be better than those examples I just listed. But what if the reality of The Matrix wasn't revealed until the third movie? What if we follow Keanu Reeves through 2 genre fiction stories and only find out in the third one that he's actually a slimy man fetus with a built-in Oculus Rift? There's a reason that The Matrix, Ready Player One, and even non-computer-based simulations like Westworld focus on the characters outside of the simulation. The inner level of fiction has to have an internal consistency, and the characters have to have free will, otherwise there's no stakes at all. Dolores Abernathy begins her story as a literal NPC, and her development of free will is the core of her character arc. Because in Westworld, just like in The Matrix, there is an intercourse between worlds that doesn't exist in binary realities like The Princess Bride. You may be wondering what any of this has to do with an atmospheric horror movie starring Naomi Watts. Well, wonder no longer, because I'm about to tell you. But first, let me remind you I am going to be spoiling most of Koji Suzuki's Ring books. I will not be spoiling Tide, because I haven't read it. Not because I don't want to, but because there is still not an English translation after 13 years. Oh, also, if you've seen The Ring, or any of the many versions of The Ring, both Japanese and American, and there's at least one Korean version, and you'd think you have the whole franchise figured out, think again. Sadako Yamamura and Samara Morgan have kind of become horror icons like, Freddy and Jason, where they kind of just show up in a bunch of sequels and do the same thing over and over again. But that could not be further from how the books are. After the first book, it's not even the same ballpark as the movie franchise. It's not even the same sport. It's not even the same plane of reality. See where I'm going with this? The Ring series begins with a novel that's pretty much the same as the 1998 movie and its 2002 American remake. There's a cursed videotape that causes you to die 7 days after watching it, and it was created by a psychic girl with really long hair who was killed and thrown into a well, and the only way to prevent your death is to make a copy of the video and show it to someone else. This resolution kind of feels like an ass pull in the movies, but believe me when I say it works perfectly in the novel. Because the one aspect of the series that's kind of sidelined in the first movie is Sadako Yamamura as a virus. Also, Sadako having balls, but that's not really important here. Before she was killed, Sadako became the last person in Japan to have smallpox, and her natural powers of nensha, or thought photography, merged with the smallpox virus and imprinted on a videotape that someone left on record in the cabin above the well. Atmosphere-wise, the Ring series is psychological thriller mixed with ghost horror, but the story and the world of the books are actually more like highbrow science fiction. Science fiction like biology science fiction, but also like impossible technology science fiction, and there's definitely some eldritch horror in there. Basically, Sadako's supernatural powers always involved film and technology, even before she died, because Suzuki never totally commits to the supernatural in like a heaven and hell way. Sadako was only able to imprint on the videotape because her supernatural powers have a biological component, and the tape is only able to kill people because it causes a physical reaction in the visual cortex, which then transmits a tumor to the heart. All that is to say, the reason that copying the tape prevents you from dying is that you're actually helping Sadako spread her virus by making someone else watch it. And when protagonist Asakawa's wife and daughter watch it at the same time, they have to both make a copy of the tape, bringing the total number up to at least 3. Sadako runs into a few roadblocks when trying to get her pandemic off the ground, and no, it's not because people realized that the cure was anti-malaria horse medicine. Asakawa's in-laws willingly watched the tape to save the lives of their daughter and granddaughter, then decide to just wait out their 7 days and die peacefully without spreading the virus. Also, you could probably just destroy the tape after you copy it, which would leave the number of tapes the same, and eventually if you keep copying it over and over again, the quality will be so bad that even the nensha won't be visible. So Sadako, resourceful, ghostly psychic that she is, allows the virus to mutate in the sequel, Spiral, so that it is now transmitted instead of through videotape, through a book, which in a very 2020s style twist of metafiction is apparently identical to the actual Ringu novel. This new strain of the Ring virus has the added bizarre side effect that if a woman contracts it, as in reads the book, while ovulating, she will immediately become asexually pregnant and give birth in a few days to a clone of Sadako Yamamura, who will then grow to adulthood very quickly. I should mention here that you're not remembering wrong. Samara was definitely a kid in The Ring, and the kid who played her was 12-ish. But in the books and the Japanese movies, Sadako was at least 20 when she died. Spiral ends with the main character being given a ring virus vaccine by Ryuji Takayama, one of Sadako's victims from the first book, who apparently connected with her post-death and convinced her to give birth to him. So the main character of Spiral and his son will survive, but the rest of the Earth is doomed to either die or give birth to Sadako as the virus consumes the human race. For most of Loop, none of the characters ever mention the events of the first 2 books, even though Spiral definitely ended on a sort of apocalyptic note. There is a virus going around the world of Loop, but it's a contagious kind of cancer and has nothing to do with Sadako Yamamura or any girls in white dresses, blue satin sashes notwithstanding. The main character of Loop, Kaoru, doesn't seem to have any knowledge of the Sadako apocalypse or the rest of the first 2 books, so Loop is mainly about finding the origins of the cancer pandemic. Kaoru eventually discovers that his father was part of a top-secret project that accidentally unleashed the cancer virus on the world, a simulated reality called, you did guess it, the Loop. The Loop isn't simulated reality like a video game. It's an entire pocket universe contained in banks of thousands of supercomputers that starts with the Big Bang and then plays out at super speed and eventually catches up with the 20th century. As you may have guessed, The Loop is where the first 2 books took place. That's right. The milk-to-death horror franchise that begins and ends with a chain email videotape and a creepy girl falling down a well and crawling out of a TV is set inside a virtual reality simulation of our universe. Well, not our universe. Kaoru's universe. The universe of Loop is just as fictional as the universe of Ring and Spiral, but I can imagine that a few readers were turned off by this concept. 1, because it's a giant leap in science fiction logic, and 2, because it feels like it kind of invalidates the first 2 books, as if it makes them more fiction than they actually were, like St. Elsewhere. The Loop is different from the Matrix because the people inside the simulation don't exist outside, but it's made explicitly clear in the 4th book, Birthday, that the scientists who created the Loop consider the life inside to be equally as valid. While a video game character is built and animated and programmed by a human being outside the computer, the life inside the Loop evolved from scratch, just like it did in real life. The difference is that the simulation needed a little push. When the creators of the Loop discovered that life hadn't started evolving yet, they stepped in and bestowed on them the gift of RNA, essentially the spark of life. After that, biology started writing itself. If you were a simulation purist, the ultimate killjoy, you might argue with the scientists that forcibly adding RNA invalidates the simulation, because no one from outside our universe ever stepped in and brought us to life. Or did they? According to the RNA world theory, ribonucleic acids actually predate modern cells. They were the core and catalyst of earlier versions of cells before they were overtaken by DNA. The core ability of living cells is reproduction. Without a catalyst to get this process going, they're as inert as Sadako laying at the bottom of the well. So the chicken and egg question here is, how did cells without a catalyst develop the ability to reproduce themselves? Could it be that a being from an external reality stepped in and blessed us with life? I mean, that's a pretty common belief, isn't it? Even non-creationist Christians will sometimes say that Adam and Eve were not the first Homo sapiens to exist, but the first to be granted the divine spark of life in humanity that would allow them to ascend beyond this plane of existence. The idea that Kaoru's world might also be a computer simulation is only brought up a couple times in Loop, but it kind of casts a shadow over Kaoru's sense of reality. Once he accepts that the people in the Loop are just as real as him, he realizes there's no way to prove that his world isn't also a computer simulation, which is basically just agnosticism, but replacing God with a bank of supercomputers and an extra-dimensional New Mexico. But couldn't that be what God is? The collective intelligence or consciousness of the people running the simulation? If I stop using the word simulation, it becomes pretty apparent that what we're talking about is just deism with extra steps. If the world that created us looked pretty much the same as our world, and the humans looked the same as us, wouldn't that explain the whole made in his image thing? Wouldn't it also explain the Fermi paradox if life was only intentionally started on Earth because the people behind the simulation also live on their own version of Earth? And maybe their world is more physically complex than ours. Maybe they have a better understanding of string theory landscape, or they know what makes up a quark, or they have an explanation for the cosmological constant. Maybe they figured the people in their simulation would never bother trying to figure out what's smaller than a quark, so why even bother with a smaller unit of matter? That's just extra code that doesn't need to exist. The not-so-twisty twist at the end of Loop is that Kaoru is actually an extra-dimensional clone of Ryuji Takayama, whose genetic code was copied from the Loop and implanted into Kaoru's mother. Before this, Ryuji had no physical form outside the Loop. No one from the first 2 books did. And to try to pluck him out would be like trying to bring a video game character out of a console, making him physically real and fully sentient, but still running on his program. But going the other direction is easier. When Kaoru realizes that it was his birth that transmitted the ring virus from the Loop into the real world, where it evolved into the contagious cancer virus, he agrees to sacrifice his body in order to be digitally reproduced inside the Loop, where he becomes the reborn Ryuji Takayama we met at the end of Spiral. He gives the vaccine to the guy from Spiral, and unlike when we read Spiral, we realize he's actually going to cure the entire world, ending the sadako apocalypse and ending the cancer virus in his own world. Now, you may be wondering why the Loop scientists didn't just go back into the code and erase Sadako from existence, or write a program update that made everyone immune to the ring virus, and the answer is that the scientists are omniscient, but they're not omnipotent. The 5th book, S, explains that the scientists are able to manipulate tiny facets of the simulation, usually involving technology that is used by the people inside the Loop, which dovetails with Sadako's powers. But aside from that, all they can really do is pause the simulation and leave the universe in a state of suspended animation until they can find a way to transmit the cure inside. That's what makes an internally consistent story within a story. Can the presenter from the outer world step in and rewrite the story in a way that doesn't fit with its pre-established rules? She-Hulk did that, apparently rewriting her show while it was happening, and because of that, it's kinda hard to take anything in that show seriously, knowing it could be changed at a moment's notice. But the grandpa in The Princess Bride doesn't change a thing about the story, even when his grandson begs him to.
Who gets Humperdinck?
I don't understand.
Who kills Prince Humperdinck?
Because the story of Wesley and Buttercup is internally consistent and can stand on its own. And the same goes for Ring. Even if Suzuki had planned out Loop from the beginning, he would never have undermined his fictional reality by having one of the characters from outside the Loop just press a few buttons and make things easier for the protagonists of Ring and Spiral. Ryuji subtly guides the protagonists of both Spiral and S to carry out his orders from beyond the grave, from inside the code, and this is only necessary because the gods of the Loop had the power to create life, but not to control it. I would completely understand if someone read Loop and felt that Saint Elsewhere disappointment to find out that the events of the first 2 books weren't real. But there is a distinction to be made here. The lives of Sadako and Asakawa, and especially Ryuji, aren't just a story made up by the people outside their reality. They were real people who lived real, complete lives in a world that was complete, from the expanse of the universe down to the atoms and molecules and down to the quarks, and even smaller than that into the computer code that makes up their reality, the code that might make up our own reality. We have no way of proving it doesn't. The world of Ring and Spiral isn't tenuous. The only way to completely destroy it would be for someone in Kaoru's world to destroy thousands of supercomputers in the New Mexico desert, or for Sadako to complete her mission and end biodiversity. Despite the glass onion visual clearly putting the Loop inside Kaoru's world, from a literary standpoint, the 2 worlds are more like 2 parallel universes. They coexist, and they interact, mainly in one direction, but they don't contradict each other. I want to step in here and remind everyone, if you're enjoying the video, please drop a like and subscribe. It really helps me out. And even if you aren't enjoying the video, I got bad news for you. You're going to die in 7 days unless you share this video on at least one online platform or tell a friend. Also, all threats of bodily harm aside, joining this channel as a member or subscribing to my Patreon would go a really long way in helping me make more videos like this. For as little as $1 a month, my patrons get early and ad-free videos, and also my weekly serialized short stories, which essentially amounts to a full novel every 9 months. There's also comic books, art, CGI models, and I'm even working on programming a couple video games. Higher tier patrons will even get free copies of my novels, and speaking of novels, if you want to support Rico Talks, but you'd rather have a book in hand right now than piecemeal over 9 months, check out my historical science fiction novel When in Rome. I think viewers of this video will find it particularly interesting. Spoilers. Now let me tell you about Flatland. It's a novella starring a sentient square in the eponymous fictional two-dimensional world, where everyone is a Euclidean form, a square, a circle, a triangle. All the men, the women are just flat lines for some reason. The shapes can all recognize each other, even without a third dimension, and this is where I kind of take issue with the book. The author seemed to really want to hammer home the fact that we see in one dimension fewer than we exist in, so he has the two-dimensional shapes see each other as lines, which is his idea of one dimension. But the truth is, without a third dimension, they couldn't be visible at all. They're not just really flat, they're infinitely flat. These guys only exist in the third dimension to the extent that we exist in the fourth. So just ignore the fact that they can see each other and assume that the shapes have a logical means of recognizing each other. Maybe it's echolocation. Like I said earlier, a sphere comes from the three-dimensional world, Spaceland, and blows the square's mind by moving up and down on the z-axis, which again, makes the square think he's a circle who can grow and shrink at will. The sphere proves his Flatlandian omniscience by looking inside the buildings, because of course, in Flatland, seeing anything from above is incomprehensible. Also, there are no ceilings in Flatland, because it would be impossible for something to move under something else. For the purposes of illustration, author Edwin Abbott, who wrote under the pen name A Square, which is both a great mathematical joke and the name of the protagonist, shows us a world of one dimension, where the residents are just a bunch of lines lined up in a row, unable to move side to side. Each line is only able to see each other as a point, which is again that logical issue of sight, and A Square is frustrated to realize that he can't convince the lines to just move side to side the way he does. We also see a world with less than one dimension, where the only resident is a single solipsistic point, who just kind of sits there and tells himself how great he is to be the only being in existence. That's not really important here, but it kind of goes along with Suzuki's themes of the importance of diversity, both culturally and biologically. Because if Sadako had succeeded in transforming everyone on Earth into her and killing everyone else, she wouldn't really have much to do besides sit around and congratulate herself. At least until she found a way to make clones of her in the outer reality, or until she discovers how to create a loop inside the loop to create subjects in her image that she can rule over and stay hands-off except for a miracle or two, while the subjects decide through vibes that the reason they exist is to know, love, and serve Sadako. And then eventually, Kaoru Ryuji, as her only begotten son, would have to once again descend realities to sacrifice himself for the good of the loop. Flatland was a social satire, but it was also a great, simple explanation for dimensional geometry. There's even a part at the end where A Square asks the sphere, what if there's something beyond the third dimension? What if there's a fourth dimension? And of course the sphere doesn't believe him, because this is all kind of metaphors for religion. But A Square figures if you multiply a line by itself in the second dimension, you get a square, and you can multiply a square by itself in the third dimension and get a cube. What happens if you can multiply a cube by itself through the fourth dimension? Just 4 years after Flatland came out, someone came up with a name for that kind of shape. It's called a tesseract, and the only way we can visualize it is through animation. I'm not a geometrical scholar, and I just really enjoy Euclid's elements, but I think the idea of the tesseract is that while we in the third dimension see it moving and shifting, a fourth dimensional entity would be able to see it in all of its forms all at the same time. A Square is unable to comprehend that the sphere could be all of its apparent diameters, basically an infinite number of circles, all at the same time, and at the same time, it's impossible for us to comprehend how anyone could see this moving and shifting shape as a static object. I believe this is related to the concept of time as the fourth dimension, because based on the Tesseract and the Flatland analogy, I can see that time is the main difference between how we view objects and how beings of a higher dimension would view those objects. Again, I don't really know, but if there are any geometry whizzes watching this, please tell me if I'm getting it wrong in the comments and let me know your thoughts on this whole thing, because I would really love to learn more about it. I also like to imagine, just extrapolating off of Flatland, that a fourth dimensional entity would be able to see the inside and outside of a three-dimensional object simultaneously, the way the sphere was able to see the insides of the buildings and the people in Flatland, and A Square was able to see the length of the line. A clear difference between Flatland and Loop is that Kaworu doesn't exist in fewer dimensions than the people outside. Both versions of the world are three-dimensional, and if the same goes for the unconfirmed world outside of Kaworu's, Kaworu would be able to recognize them as three-dimensional human beings, just like he recognizes the people around him even though he originally came from the Loop. That's the difference between the glass onion of simulations and actual theism. The world that created our world would be impossible to see or access, but the people there wouldn't be incomprehensible deities like the Abrahamic God or Lovecraft's pantheon. It's only possible for Kaworu to move outside the loop and then back in, because the two worlds run on the same laws of physics. At the same time, the loop obviously doesn't require the same amount of power or space as Kaworu's world. The supercomputers presumably run on regular electricity, and there's no mention of them making a dent in the New Mexico electrical grid. So how can the world inside the loop really be as expansive as the world outside? Well, we will have to remember that this is science fiction, not science fact, and the loop is pretty much just as insane as imprinting your ghost powers onto a videotape. That being said, I do kind of object to the idea that a simulation of the universe would take up an impossible amount of power. Think about it like a video game. To go with a specific example, off the top of my head, let's just say Fallout 76. I say that because it's the only online video game I play, and also because I stream it sometimes on this channel, so if you're a Fallout fan, stop in sometime for a stream. Fallout 76 is set in a post-apocalyptic West Virginia, and the map represents roughly 16 square miles. I don't really know how video game servers work, but I know Bethesda keeps those 16 miles up and running, and I know my laptop can render it in real time with no difficulty. True, the graphics of Fallout 76 aren't exactly photorealistic, but that's my point. If the residents of Appalachia were sentient, they wouldn't be bothered by seeing the same texture on two different rocks or seeing a tree clipping into a wall. They'd probably just brush it off as one of those glitch in the Matrix moments. Or they'd post a picture on one of those photo dumps that was always on the right side of the Facebook screen, 10 photos that prove nature is absolutely amazing. It's pretty clear in Loop and Birthday that Sadako's simulated reality looks exactly like the outside world, but let's pretend for just a second that the loop looks like Fallout 76. Asakawa and Ryuji wouldn't be wigged out by the low frame rate or the repeating textures of their world, because this is the only world they know. If one of them was capable of seeing outside the loop, they might not be able to comprehend the crisp and clean visuals. Growing up Catholic, I was sometimes told that when you get to heaven, you'll realize that this is the real world, and that the world you just left was a poor imitation, and that heaven might even be made up of colors we can't comprehend. It would be the same thing if a character from a pretty realistic video game was able to come into the real world. The final episode of the first Hulu season of Futurama presents a similar setup that couldn't be more perfect for illustrating what I'm talking about. Farnsworth creates a simulated reality, starting off with low-res versions of the Planet Express crew, but he keeps upping the graphics and computing power until the simulation becomes indistinguishable from reality. The real versions of the characters do touch on the paranoia of realizing they might themselves be in a simulation, but the simulated versions fast-track this theory and decide to put it to the test, trying to overload the computers running their universe, even if it means destroying everything. Bender is sent in to save the simulation, just like Kaworu, and Farnsworth eventually decides to slow down the simulation almost infinitely, which will put off the simulated character's discovery for centuries of real time. Just like when the loop was shut down to avoid the Sadako apocalypse, the simulated Futurama characters are unaware that anything has changed, because their brain functions and the code that makes up their entire reality have been slowed to an equivalent speed. It's also heavily implied in this episode that the main reality of Futurama is itself a simulation, since Bender comes back to life in the same way that his simulated form accepted his consciousness from above. But surely this wouldn't ruin any fans' perceptions of Futurama. I mean, we're still focused on the same plane of reality we always have been. Let me give you one more example. In a Season 7 episode of How I Met Your Mother, Ted and Marshall get lost trying to find the concession stand at a concert venue, and constantly keep getting roped back into the deep interpersonal discussion they're having about various ongoing plot lines. There's a slightly surreal quality to this episode that's justified when we find out that Ted and Marshall have been high the whole time, and all of their interactions have taken place in under 2 minutes. Whether or not this is an accurate portrayal of taking edibles in your 30s, the character developments and plot stepping stones Ted and Marshall shared throughout the episode remain valid after the end of this episode. And thanks to sitcom logic, they could comprehend each other perfectly well throughout the whole episode, even if they sounded like they were talking gibberish to the outside. In the same way, a computer simulation may reach the same heights of visual integrity as the world outside, but the people inside it will not have the outer world as a frame of reference. Farnsworth's simulation becomes photorealistic. At least it looks exactly the same as the ultra-stylized matte graining art of the outer world. But the simulated characters wouldn't have noticed if they remained color-coded monoliths, any more than A Square would have wondered about a third direction if the sphere had never appeared to him. One prevailing theory within simulation theory is that the speed of light is a constant variable set to limit the power consumption of the universe, which was also touched on in that Futurama episode. Why was that episode so good? The rest of the season was ass. It was written by the guy who made the show what it is, and not some streaming era revival hack. That explains it. It does stand to reason that a simulated reality would take up less virtual space than the actual universe takes up physical space, but thanks to video games, we know there are shortcuts, like draw distance. On a small scale, maybe the interior of Antarctica and all the penguins don't get rendered until there's a human there to look at them. And maybe the depths of the ocean don't get fully rendered until James Cameron shows up. On a large scale, the speed of light maintains that we will never be able to see more than 50 billion light years away from Earth, because the light from the Big Bang still hasn't caught up with us. On a medium scale, the simulation could be rendering a dynamic skybox around us, only bothering to render the actual planets when a human leaves Earth. This would be a literal, almost observable interpretation of the participatory anthropic principle, which I talked about extensively in my Evangelion video. It could also be an answer for why some particles behave differently when they're observed. It's like Schrodinger's loop. Simulation theory has existed in some form or another for thousands of years, ever since Zhuangzi dreamed he was a butterfly who had just woken up from a dream about being Zhuangzi. Plato had his cave, and Descartes had his evil demon turned brain in a jar, but while Descartes was mainly talking about a universe that exists as an illusion inside the mind of the one and only sentient being, he brings up a pretty solid parallel, but also contradiction to simulation theory. Because the loop and real life are not like the Matrix, where we're being held captive by a race of machines who are using our external bodies as human batteries, or like Descartes' concept, where we're the one and only source of intelligence and information in the universe, like the egotistical point in Flatland. Inside the loop, the world evolved exactly the same as it did in the outer world, from the Big Bang to the expansion of the universe, to the emergence of life, to all the little butterfly whispers of cause and effect that led one particular guy to watching one particular videotape. You could say that Sadako's psychic powers are a result of living in the simulation, and while I do believe that she's more in tune with the code of the loop than everyone else, there's no reason to say that couldn't also happen in Kaoru's world. The only real difference between the loop and the second smallest layer of the glass onion is that the creators of the loop briefly stepped in to bestow the divine blessing of ribonucleic acids. Essentially, they created man in their image, and then they breathed life into him. And who's to say someone didn't do the same for them? Or for us? At the end of the day, it's a personal preference whether you're bothered by authorial choices like the end of Saint Elsewhere or the direction of the Ring series. It may be a result of the recent general obsession with the concept of canon, or it may just be a reaction against what seems on the surface like kind of a cop-out ending. But remember that most human beings don't believe that this world is the outer layer of the glass onion. Most of them believe that we exist here at the whim of a god of some sort, whose power to create and destroy is incomprehensible to us in this layer of reality. The same way a sphere is a circle to a square, we can only comprehend God as far as our mental faculties will allow us, even if that's just the first spark of human life, even if that's just inserting ribonucleic acids into a prototypical model of the Earth. And the same goes for natives of fictional realities, no matter where they stand in the glass onion. They occupy realities smaller and simpler than ours, brought to life by the touch of a higher power, or the spark of an idea in the mind of a writer. I always have trouble ending these videos, so let me just read you a slightly reshuffled quote by the not-so-deceased Ryuji Takayama from S. The denizens of a two-dimensional plane couldn't glimpse the world of those living in three-dimensional space, or even imagine that world. Yet the opposite is feasible. If a person living in 3 dimensions picks up an ant that's crawling on a 2-dimensional plane, the ant will seem to have disappeared instantly from that world. Conversely, if the ant gets placed back down from the sky above, it'll seem like the ant has appeared from nowhere. Even so-called occult abilities can be explained easily if you posit a higher dimensional world. If you think about God, it's easy to understand. God is almighty only because he exists in a higher dimension. Our genetic information is coded in 2 intertwined strings in a language that uses only 4 letters, ATGC. You can think of it as a long string with the letters lined up and going on and on, a string wriggling in the shape of an S. You see, in the one-dimensional world, compressed information is all that exists. That's how terrestrial life came to be too, in fact. It sprouted as information compressed into a single string, with the intervention of light.